Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our Thrive in China roundtable. We're back from a holiday period of about 4 weeks where we didn't have any sessions, but we're gearing ahead for the fall season where we're going to continue with our Thrive in China roundtable every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Central European time. The first topic for this fall season is looking at 7 reasons a limited liability company formation is the best onshore option in the Chinese mainland. Now, launching new businesses is a popular activity in China, even during this pandemic, even during the Shanghai lockdowns in April, May, beginning of June. And there is a report by Statistica, which states that by the end of 2021, approximately 48.4 million companies had been registered in China. And this is an increase from around 43.3 million by the end of 2020. So I can tell you there's been absolutely no halt in people coming into China, setting up their businesses, whether it is by local Chinese opening their businesses or by foreign investors that are coming in to expand into the Chinese market. Now, the Administration of Industry and Commerce in China is the bureau that is responsible for opening up companies, approving companies, etc. Now, there's a figure that really caught our attention where those about the rising number of companies in China. And the average rate of increase over the last 5 years has been 11% year on year. On average, during just 2021, there was an astonishing 25,000 new companies registered each day in China. And this equates to nearly 9 million new companies per year in 2021. So it's phenomenal. The numbers are phenomenal. And I want to highlight this as the first episode for this fall season, because I see a lot of fear from small, medium-sized, foreign invested companies looking to go into China. China is on their radar. It's part of their international expansion strategy, but there is reluctancy on what they should be doing and what next steps they should be taking. And I just want to highlight there are companies out there who are not letting the pandemic, not letting the border control stop them from actually fulfilling this expansion into the Chinese territory. They're continuing to establish their businesses. And I feel there's a lot of misunderstanding out there with the assumption that you have to be in China when you're actually incorporating your entity. You do not. I had a call yesterday actually with a client who was under the impression that whoever is appointed in the corporate management structure, the legal representative, has to be in China for the setup of the company and the opening of the bank account physically. And this is absolutely not the case. Now, a limited liability company, an LLC structure in China looks the same as anywhere else in the world. It's an independent legal entity owned by one or more shareholders. But there are plenty of good reasons why a limited liability company is so popular in China. And the LLC, the limited liability company structure, allows companies and startups to trade directly with the local market in domestic China. Right? It allows you to generate revenue. It allows you to trade domestically, buy and sell without having to import, export, or bring goods out into the bonded logistics parks or into Hong Kong, or exporting then overseas. Now, in this episode or this roundtable, we are going to be looking at why is the limited liability company a better option? Why are people utilizing it, China? And I've got 7 reasons why people are doing this. Now, one thing I have not mentioned yet is that the alternative option is using a representative office structure. Representative offices cannot generate revenue in China. They can only act as marketing and liaison offices where you can hire people, but that is its limitation. There's nothing else that you can do with it. And I have not received an inquiry. Maybe if even I receive 1 inquiry per year for a representative office, and the conclusion out of those discussions is in the end, they always set up an LLC in any case. So setting up in the Chinese mainland, why choose a limited liability company? The first is the limited liability protection, right? Perhaps the main reason behind the popularity of LLCs in the Chinese mainland is that they offer companies and business owners complete personal protection from liability. Essentially, should anything go wrong and the business gets into trouble, you're not personally liable as the owner or the shareholder. In total, your liability is capped at the amount that you've invested in the business. And there's not even minimum requirements. So you can put in, I mean, the lowest we've ever incorporated an entity is where the registered capital is at 50,000 RMB. And that's what you would be liable up to. So this protects you from liability for any bad debts or court injunctions incurred by the limited company, since it is regarded as a separate legal entity. Now I'm going through these legalities and these details because by a lot of small, medium-sized companies, managing directors, business owners, there's a certain level of fear and probably misunderstanding about setting up an entity in China and what liability falls upon them as individuals. I have thousands of discussions about who should be in the corporate management structure, again, because of the individual liability, et cetera. But actually, as an LLC, there is this limited liability protection. The next is low startup costs. Now, some of you might say China isn't cheap anymore. How can you say that there are low startup costs? I say that there are low startup costs predominantly because under the pandemic, there's no necessity for you to fly to China. So actually, you're cutting down your traveling costs, you're cutting down your hotel costs. Everything can be done virtually for you if you are in the corporate management structure. What is a cost is actually appointing somebody as your incorporation agent to actually fulfill the service of incorporating your entity on your behalf. Meaning they're drafting the documents in Chinese. That's a minimum requirement. We also recommend doing it bilingually. They are going to be submitting all the documents. They're going to be negotiating with the various government bureaus. During the application stage, they're going to be the coordinator for opening the bank accounts, but even there, as a legal representative, you just have to do a video conference call with the bank or make a video of yourself holding your passport. So there are tremendously lower startup costs today than there were 3 years ago prior to the pandemic. Because prior to that, everybody had this imagination, when we're setting up the entity or when we're opening a bank account, we want to be physically there, right? Now it's not the case. You don't have to be physically, you never had to be physically there. And actually now it's preventative because of these border controls and quarantine regulations, right? The minimal application costs, I mean, are really coming down to the incorporation agent. And this really comes down to who you want to choose as a provider who works with you. You can find Chinese providers who act as incorporation agents and they charge 10,000 RMB. You can work with law firms that can charge up to 150,000 RMB. It comes down to finding a neutral platform of who you actually want to work with, who does your board want you to work with? Do you have a general legal counsel company that you work with? All of this comes into play, but just note that's how wide the costs vary when you're actually establishing an entity in China. In addition to that, there is the assumption that there's this registered capital, this investment capital, paid up capital that has to go into the Chinese company, and it just sits there. I still have clients who have this belief. So I again want to eradicate this point of view where you're sending money over as investment capital and it's just literally sitting in an account. No. The paid up share capital or the registered capital, in China we call it registered capital, is considered as your working capital. So it is utilized as the initial startup capital to pay off all your expenses, whether it's rent, rental deposits, the first salaries that have to be paid for the payroll and the new headcount. It is for buying products. It is for working with the various third-party providers. If you're in e-commerce, it would be with TPs, etc. You're utilizing this capital as your working capital. In order to start your business, money needs to go into China anyway for you to be able to start paying off your expenses. It cannot, I mean, there's no reason for you to have an entity if it's not to actually start paying your suppliers or paying third parties in local currency, right? That is usually the trigger as to why you're starting to think about setting up. So this paid up capital is actually capital that you're reserving to be utilized, and eventually that money going into the account will be registered as 0 once it's all been used up. So though, this is why, again, we're saying it's low startup costs, right? The next point I want to talk about is there are great tax breaks. Now, most people consider China to be a very high tax jurisdiction. This is not really the case. When talking about the different methods of company formation in China, you have to mention the tax environment and understand fully what the tax environment is. Now, first of all, when you are putting in the registered capital or the upfront share capital, if you will, this is tax-free. So it is basically your investment capital. It's going into an account. There's no tax obligations, and you're utilizing those funds as your working capital to pay off your expenses as you are building up the business. In China, you have a unified profits tax rate of 25%, but you also have special tax rates that are available depending on the sector, the industry, the service that is being offered in market. In addition to that, there is a special profits tax treatment for small, medium-sized companies that have net profitability levels of 1 million RMB or between 1 and 3 million RMB, where the lowest rate is at 5%. So actually, there are fantastic tax breaks that are currently available in China that, again, you should be thinking about. But I want to highlight one point here, is that when you are talking about tax optimization in China, make sure that you are doing a tax simulation or a tax planning exercise to truly understand when you will become profitable and when profits tax will become applicable, okay? Most people will only find out that they will start to break even after year 3, year 4, if even, and that profits tax only comes into play in year 5, year 6, year 7. So it's very hard to understand what tax rates will be in year 5, year 6, 7. Let's say right now we're in 2022. I have no idea what the tax environment will look like in 5 to 7 years from now in China, because there are consistent changes. So it does make it hard to plan, but it's important for you to understand when are you actually going to be profitable. The next advantage in China, when you're setting up an entity on the ground, is the range of permitted business activities. Now, I do first want to highlight that there is something called the negative list. The negative list is a list of industries and sectors where you are permitted to perform activities. But there are then the restricted and prohibited lists, which highlight what industries and sectors still require JV partners or are completely not allowed to enter China. In general, there are over 2,000 permitted business activities allowing you to do business in China, which basically means the market is open for those of you that are doing cross-border, doing e-commerce, for those of you that are doing retail, that are selling to the consumers. You might have to buy additional licenses, for example, an F&B, but you're not prohibited or restricted from actually trading in the food and beverage sector, right? So I want to highlight that it's become easier and easier to set up your own entity without JV partners and to be able to perform business on your own in China. Compared to when I first arrived in 2004, there's a huge difference in this. It's much more flexible and liberal. Point 5 is you can set up anywhere in China. There is no city zone that is going to restrict you from establishing. They may have certain criteria for you to set up in that district or zone or whatever. That's something that you have to research to understand what those criteria will be. Is it a registered capital, i.e. a shared capital requirement? Is it number of employees, number of specific types of employees, etc. But ultimately, you can actually set up anywhere in China. So again, here, one thing that we highly recommend to do is to conduct a location study to truly understand what is the best province, municipality, city, district that fits your China strategy. Because what you don't want to do is choose a place and say, oh, I want to move around. That's where there will suddenly be limitations. So one of the disadvantages of having an entity in China is you can't just move your company from one place to another, but you can actually set up anywhere you like. It's just a matter of making sure you do the preparation work. I always say preparation is key to success. Do the preparation work to understand strategically what is the right location for your business now and in the future. But having said that, another advantage is that you can always branch out. And actually, this is something that the Chinese government is now encouraging through restrictions on employment of individuals that are located outside of your main company city. So to give you an example, let's say you set up an entity in Shanghai and you want to now establish your company, establish a branch in Guangzhou or hire somebody in Guangzhou. The requirement from an employment perspective, a labor perspective, is that you do have to set up a branch office in Guangzhou in order to pay the local social insurances to that individual. Otherwise, they will have to take on the social insurances of Shanghai, which is your main entity. But you can branch out anywhere. And this is actually something that the Chinese government is encouraging through these labor requirements. So if you decide that you want to expand into, you're set up in Shanghai, you want to expand into Beijing, Chongqing, Chengdu, Wuxi, Wuhan, wherever you want to go, you have the ability to set up these branch offices. And you have the flexibility to decide whether you want to set up a non-operational branch, meaning it's just a liaison office, or you actually want to establish a operational branch that can also do its own invoicing through that entity. The last one that I want to highlight as an advantage, again, for setting up your own entity, is that you can set up with multiple shareholders. Now, this might seem obvious for all of you that, of course, you can have multiple shareholders in an LLC. It's true, but the trend that I'm seeing right now is that foreign investors are looking for local investors, local partnerships, and there's always a question as to whether these local investors and partners will become part of this Chinese structure, this Chinese entity. Now, I always recommend getting advice before this because there might be better business models created for these structures, but it is just to say that you can set up an entity in China with multiple shareholders, with multiple nationalities to help you to acquire more funding for the business. Now, this is all to highlight why actually you should be setting up an LLC in the Chinese market. And again, I want to emphasize the stats that I mentioned earlier, and I don't want to make a mistake on them. But the stats are that in 2021, there were 25,000 companies, new companies established almost each day in China. And I know that, the next question will be how much of that was foreign investors, how much of that was local Chinese companies. I don't have that breakdown. But it is just to say that foreign investors have not stopped going into the market due to the pandemic. And that has been a red flag for a lot of companies, a lot of SMEs, saying due to the pandemic, due to the border controls, due to the fact that we can't travel there to open up the company, we're not going to go ahead. This has basically halted your business in China if this is the mindset and mentality that you're having, right? So I do want to encourage people to explore that more, to truly understand that they can do things from where they're sitting internationally, globally. They don't have to be physically on the ground in China to perform that. Now, setting up in the Chinese mainland is as easy as saying the word LLC. It has become much more simplified. And something that's been very interesting from our perspective is that we had about 5 or 6 different incorporations halted due to the Shanghai lockdowns and documents being held up by the courier companies in April, May, and early June. But I have to say that as soon as the government offices open and as soon as the courier companies were releasing packages and we had the ability to submit, we were getting business licenses issued within 5 working days. I mean, it was phenomenal. So I do want to highlight that. What is the practice of actually setting up the company in China? Because of course, when somebody does research online, they're going to find out that it takes 6 months, 8 months, 9 months to open up a company. The reality is that what takes a long time is the preparation work. It's understanding how you're going to structure the company. And as soon as that is finalized and you're ready with that information to implement, the drafting of the documents, the sending of couriers back and forth, I guess sending the couriers is the only inefficiency right now with the border controls. Sending the packages, the couriers back and forth with documents. But once we receive everything in original, it takes 5 days to get your business license. And all the steps thereafter are actually relatively swift. So if a client really listens to us and really answers emails and all of that timely, we can get a company incorporated within 3 to 4 months. And that's including the bank account, which takes in itself about 1 month, 25 to 30 working days. So things are actually moving swiftly. And I've highlighted a little bit the process here in a very generic point of view, in terms of understanding what your business activities are, talk to a company formation specialist on the best business scope that you want to generate. Make sure you choose a Chinese company name. And this is, again, all part of the preparation work, which can take time. So make sure you get the prep work done so that you're just ready to execute, sign off, and send back. Once the name is registered, basically everything is printed off, it's all submitted online. You then get all your draft documents, which are then amended accordingly, sent over by email. You have to print out as the client, sign off on it, courier back. Now, again, the courier aspect is currently the holdup because China isn't really out of the pandemic and lockdown. So currently, when you are sending documents or packages to China, there is a holding period of between 7 to 10 days where they go through what's called COVID checks. They test the packages to see if there's any COVID material, if you will, on them. So, when I send a FedEx package, I use DHL from Luxembourg to my Shanghai team. It does take around 7 to 10 working days for them to receive it. But it's really all about keeping it simple. And I wanted to highlight in today's episode, that actually setting up in China is not as complicated and complex as it used to be. It has simplified itself tremendously over the last 20 years. In that, if you are ready to execute your business in China, you're ready to start trading in China, understand that there are no limitations to do this. You can go ahead, set up your entity from where you are sitting today. All you need to do is appoint an incorporation agent, which, like I said, can be a law firm, can be a corporate services firm, can be a local Chinese incorporation agency, with whomever you like to work with, right? But ultimately, once you get all your documents ready and they are submitted, you're getting your license within a matter of days, within 5 to 10 working days. So it has become relatively swift. And just again, to repeat, it does take between 3 to 4 months to set up a company now, as long as you follow what your incorporation agent is telling you to do, and you're following those guidelines. So I would love to hear what your biggest takeaway from today was. This is a very short presentation today because ultimately I'm looking at the 7 reasons. I can just very quickly recap what those are. One was limited liability protection. Again, people always have this feeling that they're liable for whatever they're going to be doing in China, and there's this fear that they're going to get caught and put in a Chinese prison. That's not the case. Understand what the legalities are around having an entity in China. Talk to a lawyer, talk to a corporate services firm, and they can take those fears away from you. The other is the low startup costs. I am emphasizing that today because actually, prior to the pandemic, everybody used to travel to China to set up their companies, even though they didn't have to. Now, they realize they can cut all those costs away. So that the flight costs, the hotel costs, the business trip expenses, etc. And ultimately, the only cost that is left over is the incorporation agency fees to actually implement the entity. You can also now set up your structures in not virtual offices, but in office spaces where you can just rent workstations, again, lowering that initial startup cost for renting an office space, etc. So actually, it's really come down compared to 4 years ago. Number 3 is the great tax breaks. Again, something I want to encourage to everybody is understand when you're actually going to become profitable and realize what special tax treatments are available to SMEs and to your industry and sector that you are in. Number 4 is the range of permitted business activities. There's only a small percentage of industries and sectors that are still prohibited and restricted, meaning that the market is open for foreign investors. 5 and 6 is all about setting up anywhere in China. Again, I encourage people to do location studies, and the fact that you can also now branch out, meaning that if you have an entity in Shanghai, you can expand into other cities by setting up branch offices, whether they're operational or non-operational. And it is something that the government is encouraging you to do. And last but not least, if you are on the trend or lookout for local investors, Chinese investors or APAC investors, you can have multiple shareholders within your structure. Doesn't matter the nationality of those individuals. You can always change your structure of your company. And again, this is something that people who are not in my world of Chinese corporate services don't always realize, is that you can change your shareholder structure. You can change your business scope. You can change your registered office address. All of these things can actually be amended. Your structure is flexible enough for you to be able to do that. The downside to it is that there's always going to be a cost associated with using a law firm or an agency to do that work. And the second is obviously the bureaucratic procedure and the time involved to make those changes. But they are just as swift nowadays, if you've got the paperwork rightly set up, than ever before. So we're going to end there. And if you guys are interested to work with Woodburn, we offer a whole variety of different services, from brand advisory to the recruitment of in-house finance teams. We help with incorporation advisory, incorporations in China. Just to highlight, we're not a law firm. So for example, if you do have multiple shareholders, we do highly encourage you to work with law firms to get those joint venture contracts or shareholder agreements set up accordingly to protect yourself as one of the shareholders. So we do collaborate a lot with law firms on these legal documents that are required. And if you're interested in setting up your company in China, let's have a conversation. You can email me at Kristina@woodburnglobal.com for that. And just to give you a heads up on what the next topics are going to be. So next week, we're going to be talking about the top 10 checklist to set up a company in China. What does it take? The following week, we're looking at 5 reasons to switch your company from a representative office to a China LLC. We're seeing more of that happening now, where companies are upgrading themselves. Then 10 reasons why businesses are not successful in China, 4 areas that are eating away at the profit margins. And then we're going to be doing a whole series on employment and labor, because we are seeing changes, and obviously less quarantines, no more PU letters are required. So we are seeing changes in how foreigners can get back into China now, and what are the latest updates around the labor laws and the general employment law questions. So stay tuned on all of that. And Irina, Richard, thank you for joining me today. And for those that are going to watch on replay, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I hope this video has helped. I hope the roundtable has helped. And I hope to see you all again very soon. Take care and goodbye.